Most people think time is like a river that flows swift and sure in one direction. But I have seen the face of time, and I can tell you, they are wrong.
Before we talk about Ubisoft's Sands of Time proper, there are a few things I have to mention. First, if you want to play the game on modern PCs, be ready to deal with tons of issues, ranging from increased fog volumes, non-rendering water, audio desync, analog stick sensitivity, and a bunch of other stuff that didn't exist at the time of release. While all the problems are fixable, honestly in some ways it's just much simpler to play the console versions. But speaking of console versions, while the PlayStation 3 remaster is absolutely playable, it has various audio issues of its own and also misses quite a lot of visual effects, which in combination with increased rendering resolution and texture sharpness makes the game a bit difficult to read sometimes, and not fully representative of the original intention. Case in point. It's also missing the bonus content from the original console releases, which includes the first Prince of Persia game on PS2, Xbox and GameCube, Prince of Persia 2 on Xbox, and the GameCube GBA connectivity features. Other than all these technical, bonus and visual differences, this is the same game across the board. A game that creates an interesting question. What is the identity of Prince of Persia as a brand? On the surface, Sands of Time shares the same core elements as the previous games: platforming, traps, combat. But in practice, the implementation of those elements couldn't be more different. The controls of the prince in the first titles were heavy. Here, they're not. They're still fluid in terms of animation, but are very light in terms of weight. There's barely any wind-ups to your actions, which means that instead of every jump being a precision-heavy event, in Sands of Time you do tons of acrobatics with the game magnetically assisting you if your precision was just a bit off. And even then, if you fail, most traps aren't actually as deadly as in the original games, except when they make you fall down. Timing, of course, is still of essence, but it's a different kind of timing. Combat in the old games was very grounded and realistic. In Sands of Time, you vault around, jump off walls, backflip and roll and just do all kinds of fancy stuff that would never happen before. It's all the more interesting considering that Prince of Persia 3D tried to keep all those elements intact. It tried to keep the controls heavy, it tried to make precision matter, it tried to have very realistic combat. Sure, it was very unpolished, but the direction was there. Sands of Time, on the other hand, is not an evolution or a reimagining of those principles. It forgets about them to create an entirely new definition of what Prince of Persia is. One that's focused on the feeling of flow, of smoothly chaining button presses to go from one action to the next, and in case a mistake happens, well, not to worry, you can rewind with your dagger of time and try again. I find it interesting that back in the day, when internet discussions about brand identities weren't as prominent as they are now, a game could just redo absolutely everything the franchise was about and get widely accepted regardless. But I guess when you have a game that's as fantastic as Sands of Time, there's absolutely no reason to disregard it in any way. Sands of Time is almost perfect. Really, there is only one problematic aspect in the game, though since it's very prevalent, it's particularly difficult to ignore: enemy and encounter design. I specifically avoid using the word combat because that would imply that there is issues with the systems, which outside of some cases when the animation system and environment collisions don't fully gel well, I wouldn't say there are. The moveset is not big, but it's encompassing enough, there are some skill-based mechanics like counters, and the overall principles surrounding crowd control and the fact that enemies are never truly dead until you sap their sands with a dagger are solid. But enemies are so boring in terms of their gameplay design. They might look different, but they act pretty much the same. As a result, to defeat most of them you have to just fold over to knock them down and then use the dagger. Some are immune to that, in which case instead of vaulting you just rebound off a wall. And this wouldn't be that bad if not for the amount of enemies you have to fight in every encounter. Even though there's only 4 on screen at a time, new ones keep teleporting in, so in the end you fight like 20 or 30 of them. Fights would feel even more like a slog if not for the simply amazing music accompanying them. What makes encounters worse is that in half of them you have to protect Farah. She's an archer who doesn't have a lot of health. It's not that she's not helpful, her arrow stunts and interrupts are actually very useful. However, unless specifically scripted, she just refuses to move away from enemies to try and keep some distance. So in a lot of fights everyone's pretty much ganged up in a location where Farah is standing, which is usually close to a corner or a wall, and the camera doesn't always perform well in such places, so you often don't see clearly what you're doing, which means you might attack the wrong enemy and it all just becomes a mess, where Farah might die even if monsters attack you, because they tend to have a wide hit range and she just keeps standing still. Culminating in what by now is probably infamous elevator fight close to the end of the game. And it's made worse by the fact that Sands of Time understands exceptionally well how to create emotions and stories through gameplay. Many video games are inspired by cinema, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with cutscenes or linear set pieces. They are very effective tools when used right. However, there are many titles that go a bit overboard with those tools in an attempt to feel cinematic. But Sands of Time feels cinematic while keeping the central focus on gameplay pretty much all the time. It achieves that through a number of layers. The first one is the narrative wrapper. The whole game is actually the prince retelling his story to someone. Now, one effect of that is some meta-commentary, like when you die, the prince rapidly corrects himself that this is not what happened.
That didn't happen.
That's certainly cute and it works, but the real strength of this approach is the possibility for the prince to tell about his thoughts and feelings naturally, without monologuing to himself or elaborate cutscenes, just by showcasing the location we have to complete with some narration.
A soldier's mess hall. The smell of food still wafted from the kitchen. Scant hours ago, these tables had been filled with men, joking in camaraderie over their evening meal. Just as my father's men do back home in Siraf, enemies because they think themselves safe within the castle walls with no enemy to fight.
Elaborate cutscenes and monologues still do happen, of course, but thanks to this wrapper they're used more sparingly, so when they are utilized it would have a stronger emotional resonance.
Oh, have you been waiting here all this time? I didn't realize you meant these baths. I went to the other baths, clear across the other side of the city. I had a lovely wash and a rub with fragrant oils. Too bad you weren't there. Stop talking to yourself!
The second layer is closely related to the first, contextualization. Every section has a distinct theme to it. Oh, these are the baths, this is the menagerie, here's the guest bedrooms, and so on. And half of the obstacles have been caused by the blast after unleashing the Sands of Time, while the other is traps that you have brought upon yourself by activating the palace's defense system. It's not just spikes and rolling blades randomly put all over the place, but something that's supposed to protect the palace from intruders. Even regaining health is contextualized through drinking water, which is very cool, although I guess it's better not to think that in some places people bathe in the water you drink. That gently leads us to the next layer, which is spacing, and it's absolutely perfect. Yes, the combat sections are a bit annoying, but the placement of enemy encounters themselves is sensible. Sands of Time knows precisely when to switch up the environments or obstacle or activity type before it gets boring. Just before you get tired of going through crumbling palace environments, you activate the already mentioned trap system through a prolonged puzzle and have to deal with that. Just before you get tired of traps, you get outside, and now elements you've used to interacting with before get recontextualized as trees, branches, and cliffs. Eventually you get back to the palace, but now it's daytime, so everything looks different. All while the main character himself also changes appearance throughout the adventure. As you go on, clothes become more tattered and damaged, until eventually you're left entirely without a shirt, so all the wounds and scars from your journey could be laid bare. The game is linear, there is not really any exploration besides a little bit of attention required to find entrances to a mystical location that increases your health, and vortexes that increase the capacity of your dagger's power. Sands of Time wants you to keep moving forward. And one of the reasons is to serve the emotional layer, how Prince's mental state represented through level design, gameplay and agency is transposed onto the player. When after prolonged adventures together you get separated from Farah, not only do you get in dark and gloomy caves, but also this is the only location in the game that has prolonged parkour sections where everything is crumbling down and you can't stop. Now, mind you, of course environments that fall down are used in plenty obstacles throughout Sands of Time, but it's no surprise that a very long sequence of such gameplay elements is specifically put only in this segment to associate Farah's absence with increased stress, which would be a big contrast to the previous, more leisurely parkour puzzly segments where you and Farah would carve a way out together. Which plays into the relationship layer where throughout the game you learn to trust Farah. Trust that is toyed with in the visions you see at every save point. Now, these visions show bits and pieces of a location you will have to complete next. And they're always true. But eventually, weird stuff starts appearing, like the prince dying or Farah betraying you. So this naturally leads to both the prince and you as a player beginning to wonder if you should trust the visions or trust the person. So you can see why it is so problematic that during combat, Farah often becomes a point of frustration. Sands of Time crafts the connection between gameplay, emotions and narrative so well, transposing feelings onto players so intricately, that the frustration caused by Farah as an AI entity that often leads to failure sort of goes against the blossoming romance between her and the prince. During some very dramatic moments, you sort of have to segregate your combat gameplay feelings from what the narrative wants you to feel, which is a shame because the chemistry between Prince and Farah is really good.
Listen to this. Of what use is reason against the power of love? Love is life. So if you want to live, die in love. Die in love if you want to stay alive.
What's that supposed to mean?
I thought you'd like it.
If you want to be useful, try finding a book that'll tell us how to get out of here.
This isn't that kind of game.
Game? She thinks this is a game.
Not that there's much else to the story besides character development. Sands of Time is a classic, straightforward, coming-of-age tale about understanding, responsibility, and I'm not saying that as a criticism. It's one of the best stories of its kind, largely precisely because the game leans onto the strengths of the medium through all the means I've mentioned before. And none of the issues are big enough to prevent the game from getting a Costiuc rating of 99. Honestly, if the game would fix its combat-related problems, the unhindered emotional resonance could help it get a full-on 110. But hey, to me, everything above 100 is mostly a bonus, since as it is now, Sands of Time might be somewhat flawed, but it's still exceptionally made, intricate, perfectly paced, great looking, great sounding, and in so many ways, just an astounding magical adventure.